Well, thank you all for being here, and welcome to this Process and Faith Book Club webinar. So today we have the special privilege of being with minister, author, and activist, Reverend Dr. Timothy Murphy. So Timothy is senior pastor of Plymouth Congregational Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and formerly served as executive director of Progressive Christians Uniting, which is a faith and social justice organization based in Southern California. He also taught courses in religion and politics at Claremont School of Theology, where he earned his PhD in process studies. So, of course, a big hero to our Center for Process Studies and the Process of Faith community. Today's topic for the webinar is Timothy's latest book, Sustaining Hope in an Unjust World, How to Keep Going When You Want to Give Up. Amazing topic, amazing title. Timothy, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everyone, for being here to hear more about the book. So what I'm going to do is I'll do a little bit of a presentation about the book, why I wrote it, how it relates to certain ideas, what we need to sustain hope in an unjust world, and then I think I'll read a brief excerpt, probably from the beginning, and then take your all's questions and whatever questions you have. Some of you may have read the book, some of you may be considering whether you want to purchase the book, but I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. I'll do that and see, is it, can you see that?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Go.
Yes, so there's the cover, Sustaining Hope in an Unjust World. As Andrew said, this is my second book. My first one was a more academic work on process ecclesiology and liberation thought, and this one is much more focused on practical matters of looking at how do we sustain hope in an unjust world, because as we know, things are not necessarily the way we want them to be in our world today. So let me just say a little bit about kind of why I wrote this book. So I don't know if you've noticed, but there's lots of injustice in the world. Things are not necessarily going the way we want them to see. So over the past at least 10 years, I've been pretty involved in faith and social justice efforts, whether that was on saying no to Prop 8 in California back in 2008, or immigrant rights. Now it's more on climate activism, climate justice, and also anti-racism work. But in a lot of the work I was involved with and campaigns, you know, the Poor People's Campaign, I often saw this rhetoric, this rhetorical statement that kind of equated the need for victory with the guarantee that victory was going to happen. And I think, you know, that's fine in the moment. Like if you win in some effort for a more just world, whether that's very locally, whether it's regionally, whether it's political, whether it's more social, but often we don't win. Things do not get better. And so there's no guaranteed victories or inevitable progress. Just as some things are getting better, some things get worse. I think we could agree that the health of the planet and climate change is empirically worse than it was 20, 50 years ago. Income and wealth inequality are worse than they were decades ago. The voting rights for African Americans is worse than it was 50 years ago, while some things, maybe the wage gap between men and women has improved. So some things get better, some things actually get worse. But what I was seeing and what I was really thinking about was that I was seeing a lot of people giving up after defeats. So these are religious people or secular activists, social justice people who really struggled with, if not the overt theological questions like where's God in all this, but where can I not just despair and become cynical or jaded and burn out and check out. And so seeing that reality happening, I wanted to reflect for myself and for others, in how might that be something we could process together and make sense of. And so the intended audience of this book, it's a general audience book, so persons who have some interest in social justice, some interest in religious and theological reflection, not necessarily ministers, but it can include ministers, maybe some seminarians, but also especially small groups, whether in a church setting or potentially in other sorts of settings. So the book is not front loaded with a lot of theology, though I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in a second, but I didn't want to scare away people of conscience who might be open to some of the things that the book has to say, but don't necessarily care about God and religion per se as things that they find helpful in a struggle for a more just world. But it's definitely there. So in that regard, I want to kind of just say a little bit of some of the influences of this book. So probably a number of you are familiar with theologies of hope and theologies of liberation. These are a couple different schools of thought that have been pretty famous in theological life over the past 50 years. And especially a book called Sustaining Hope is going to have some connection with theologies of hope. The former comes from Jürgen Moltmann and this notion of the coming kingdom of God. And so that faith and discipleship is very much focused on an eschatological vision of the coming kingdom of God, of a reign of justice and peace where God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven. And I think there's a lot that I like about that. And likewise with theologies of liberation, starting with Black liberation theology and Latin American liberation theology, both of them and others that as it has expanded over the past 50 years, start from the underside of history and the oppressed, when we need to look at how to analyze what's happening in our world and how to think theologically about that, to really start from that perspective. And that is definitely things that I find very helpful. But I'm not uncritical with those schools. This is a book that's also definitely influenced by process theology and process thought. That's why the Process and Faith book club, it's part of that, is that often theologies of hope and liberation have what I consider to be misconceptions of God and power. That they can imply this equating of the need for a certain change and the guarantee that is going to happen. As one Black theologian in the 70s wrote in his famous book with a very provocative title, "Is God a White Racist?" He was asking the question, well, if God is all-powerful and we need liberation and we're being oppressed, why haven't we been liberated yet? Maybe God is in favor of what's happening. And he obviously didn't believe that, but he wanted to help Black theology rethink a bit about the relationship of God and power. And that's something that I think process theology and process faith has been very helpful in doing, that there are some things that God can't do. And when we look at the Bible and the talk about God's relationality and God's character not changing, what doesn't change is that God is with us, that God is present in the struggles for in our lives, in our society, in those movements, but God is not necessarily with the victors. That just because those who have won or achieved what they've wanted does not necessarily mean that is a immediate blessing on what has happened. And so I find process theology very helpful there. And so in this way, this book is very much in that school of thought, though it's not a book about process theology. It just assumes it and works with it. So I noticed in one of the kind of opponents I have in the book that you all probably are familiar with is called the prosperity anti-gospel. And so the prosperity gospel has some things in common with things I find to be quite helpful, surprisingly. So one of those things is that the good news of that we're seeking is something that is in part in this life, and that the divine does not want us to be oppressed, poor, and beaten down. So in that way, I'm in agreement with this prosperity gospel. The trick is how they think about God's power as the one who can make all these miraculous things happen, and especially that we can kind of demand, if we make the right declaration that what God owes us, we can receive that through health and wealth. God wants the world to be well, and God world wants the world to be healthy, I would believe, but not in the way the prosperity gospel thinks about it, and certainly not in the way of a coercive divine omnipotence that is pulling the strings, that I think we all would, if we're here, we'd probably all agree with that. So those are some of the influences and opponents that kind of show up in the book in subtle ways. Again, it's not a treatise on different schools of thought. But let me get to kind of what I think we need, because if you're here, you're curious, well, how do we sustain hope? And I think there are, several things that are helpful in that regard. The first one is, frankly, having a historical perspective, to remember that we are not the first people who are facing challenges, that are facing oppression, that are facing the threat of the world will not be different or liberated, or if we're particularly concerned about climate change, that the world's going to end. That from the perspective of other communities, the world did end in 1492 for indigenous peoples, for West African peoples. The world ended with the imposition of slavery and being taken to the Americas, and other types of examples of more localized forms of displacement. So I think it's helpful if we learn from other communities that have gone through similar traumas and have yet endured and survived. So if we can learn from them, then that who have experienced things perhaps worse than our own particular experiences, though of course anything that you experience will feel to you as the worst possible thing, because we of course will experience things from the center of our own experience. But to recognize that there are other experiences that are not our own that we can learn from, I think is very helpful. Second, and this is particularly important with activist individuals or groups, is that we have to pace ourselves for the long haul. That, at least for myself, I can do anything for about 72 hours. I can go all in, I can go crazy and do a lot of work, but I know that when that happens, almost inevitably, I will get sick. Now, other people might have different thresholds of what they can do. There are a lot of organizers I know who basically have no life for a year, 2 years, maybe 3 years, working 70, 80 hours a week, working in communities or whatnot. But I don't know too many people who retire from organizing, whether labor or community organizing. And so this is not to say that we need to be patient with injustice. So I think this is one thing that can get confusing, is what I'm not saying is we need to be patient and incremental in seeking change, but we have to recognize that the challenges we got ourselves into are often decades, generations, centuries in the making. And so it's going to be a multi-year, multi-decade, lifetime effort of helping to have the world be a more just and loving place. And if we can't find some joy in the midst of that struggle, we're going to give up long before we get anywhere close to where we want ourselves to be. And we might have some questions on that a little later. Third, and this is kind of one of my big things I think is essential, is that we need communities of support. So I don't believe that any one of us, any individual, can do this by ourselves. We're going to get an individual might be able to go farther and faster for a little while, but communities help us when we tire, when we're sick, when we're dejected. We don't just cheer each other up, we cheer each other on. We lift each other up when we're struggling. And communities are the place, especially across generations, where we can keep a vision that another world is possible. That so it's not just something that exists for our even lifetime, but something that can endure across generations for that more just world that we're seeking. And so communities, I just don't see a way outside of those communities. And they don't necessarily have to be faith communities, but they need to be some sort of community where there's a common vision of what we're trying to hope for and how that might look. Fourth, I believe what we need is to be able to hope for a better world even when there are defeats. And so there will be defeats. I'm not saying that we can't win and make some big gains in a more just world, but it's certainly going to feel at times that we're losing more than we're winning, and that's probably true at times. So it's not just little by little better and better. So, but if we can recognize that hope is connected in the midst of defeats and loss, that is, I think that will help. And this is the part, and then this last one is the one I think that maybe is controversial in for some people, that what's enough? What is not what I wish for, but what is enough to sustain hope? And that is to keep the dream alive that another world is possible. Even if we can't achieve it, that keeping the dream of that world, in process terms, you call it the proposition or the potentiality of that, that is not it's not actual, but it's interesting, but not true, using more Whiteheadian kind of terminology. And that is enough. And so I'd like to call this also the Toy Story 3 solution. So for those who saw, not the most recent one, but the one from 2010 in Toy Story, where the toys are in a conveyor belt towards an incinerator at a dump, and they're trying to escape, and they're trying to get away, and they're trying to turn off the machine, and they can't quite do it, and the conveyor belt's just moving them slowly, again and again, closer and closer to the incinerator, and they're trying to climb out, and they just can't get out. And when everything looks hopeless, that they're not going to be able to escape, what do? They begin to reach out their hands to each other and hold each other's hands, because in that moment, that's enough. You know, they want to be rescued. They want to escape this thing, but it's enough to have each other. And so having a dream that another world is possible, that a community shares together, hoping in the midst of defeats, recognizing its historical place and pacing itself, is how we sustain hope for a more just world. Now, I did have an alternate title, which I think the publishers rightly suggested is less helpful. I still think it's kind of cute, but they talked me out of it. And that was Theology for Losers. And so what I liked about that was thinking about how we often talk about winners and losers, and we like celebrate winners and them as, you know, divinely blessed or morally superior if it's a secular setting, and often look down on those who have lost in the world. But in some ways, theology and hope really is for losers. If everything's going well for you in the world, then you don't really need hope. You just want things to continue as they are. And so I like this idea of theology for losers, but the publisher Challenge Press suggested, well, you know, maybe do people need to think of themselves as a loser in order to be interested in this book? And I'm like, oh, that's a good point. And they're like, and what if they're not interested in theology? Well, that's a good point too. So though I like it, I think that they were probably right that Theology for Losers was probably not the best best title, but we can have a conversation about that as well. So what I would like to do at this point is I'm going to read, I have a couple excerpts. I think I'll just read one for now. If we have so I'll read one excerpt from now, and if we have some more conversation, then I might read a second excerpt, but we'll just kind of go from there. So this comes from the prologue of the book, and it's just a couple of pages. It was a cancer diagnosis that made me come to grips with the fact that things do not always turn out all right. In spite of such potential failure, I also learned how we can keep the faith in the midst of seemingly insurmountable struggles for a better world. I was 19, depressed, with no appetite, and in constant pain. For the previous 6 months, my health had been declining slowly. First, it was the chronic back pain. The doctors said I had pulled a muscle, so I did stretches, took pain pills, and waited in vain for some improvement. Then, I became nauseous when eating. Instead of my previous voluminous appetite, I felt stuffed after half a sandwich. Months went by. The perpetual pain wore on my psyche. Finally, after talking repeatedly with doctors who brushed my situation aside, a new doctor and I finally agreed. I had testicular cancer. Knowing what was wrong helped a lot. So did the surgery and later chemotherapy. But before that, something else happened. My pastor came over to my family's house. He asked me how I felt, whether I was struggling with God's role, and wondered what was on my mind and heart. With his encouragement, I told him I knew that this wasn't something that God had given me as a punishment, or a test, or for any other reason. Cancer happens. The only question was the following: what would I do in response to this situation? During my stint with chemo treatments, I didn't dwell on the odds. But later, my father told me that statistically speaking, I had only a 50-50 shot at surviving what was an advanced stage of cancer. While my family and I focused on getting through months of treatment, I understood that there was no guarantee that I would get better. God wasn't controlling this process. And while some cancer patients improve, some don't. Fortunately, I did. And after the first surgery, my nausea went away and I began regaining previously lost weight. However, this isn't a book about cancer. It's about how we can understand the divine in our world, what God does and what God doesn't do, and how we are to respond. I tell the story because this experience fundamentally shaped and shapes my views of the world. But instead of giving me only a sense of personal meaning amidst such tragedy, this experience gradually led me to a different conclusion: that in spite of no proof that things will get better, we can sustain hope in an unjust world, even if we don't fully achieve it. Before becoming sick, and increasingly afterward, I was regularly outraged about social inequities, people being mistreated, violence against the weak, crushing poverty, etc. I wasn't much of an activist at the time, but my trajectory was a proto-radical one, by Western Kentucky standards at least. Partly because I had experienced significant marginalization and bullying as a child in school. Over the years, as I have become more engaged in issues of social justice, activism, public policy, and the role of faith for social transformation, I've found that my worldview frequently clashes with the prevailing assumptions of my religious and secular activist peers. Almost everyone combines their recognition of the need for a victory against oppression and evil with the guarantee of that victory, at least rhetorically. But here's the rub. We often lose, movements falter, evil triumphs. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing that we are guaranteed to lose, nor am I against the idea of winning. I'm against the assumption that we are guaranteed to win. Of course, just as there is no guarantee that we as individuals, a society, or a planet will win and triumph, there's no guarantee we will lose. Some things may get better, like gender equity, while wealth disparities get worse. I freely admit that this is a hard pill to swallow. Various psychological studies have shown that if there's one thing people on the whole dislike, it's uncertainty. This is not the uncertainty of, I don't have an opinion. It's more like scientific uncertainty. If we know something terrible is going to happen and there's nothing we can do about it, we can resign ourselves to that fate and move on. But uncertainty creates in most people a sense of paralysis. For myself, it was better to know that I had advanced cancer with the possibility of fatal consequences than just to feel horrible and to not know what was going on. We humans crave predictability, or at least some sense of knowledge and control. In the midst of so much injustice, how can we continue to struggle for a better world with all the effort that will be necessary for that possible future to have a fighting chance if there are no guarantees? What if I told you that God doesn't guarantee our victory in the struggle for social justice? That God doesn't guarantee that we will win? Instead of a promise that everything is going to be just as God intends, what if God's promise is to be with us no matter what? Could we then take these terrible problems we face and respond with steadfast compassion? Would that be enough? Could we keep up the struggle in the face of so much injustice and evil in our world? Could it be that the promise of God with us, come what may, is in fact enough? If so, we would have the beginnings of how to keep going when we want to give up. That ends the excerpt. I'm going to pause here, and Andrew, if you would like to facilitate questions people have, and we can have a discussion for however long works.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Timothy. That was wonderful. So I want to say thanks for the presentation, and also thanks for writing this timely and relevant book. I actually found it both deeply personal and relatable. And I have a number of questions, but I actually want to hold my questions till later and open it up to the rest of the audience members first. So if you have a question for Timothy, please just unmute your microphone by clicking the microphone picture in the bottom left corner of your Zoom window, and feel free to speak up.
I would just ask if anyone has a question, if they could say their name and where they're coming from also.
Well, if nobody else is going to, oh wait, Sue, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to, when you got to the part about talking about climate change, is really when a lot of what you were saying earlier kicked in, because it feels pretty hopeless that we're too late. And how do you motivate others? I can understand holding on to what I believe, that God is with us in this struggle no matter what's going to happen in the end, and there's no way of knowing exactly what's going to happen in the end. Did you have any great insights on sharing that with other people so that they can pick up and become more optimistic rather than pessimistic about the
Sure. And there are different perspectives on how to talk about climate change. I know that our kind of the leading process theologian, John B. Cobb Jr., has a slightly more semi-apocalyptic kind of approach. And I think what I said in the book is that, you know, I don't know about that approach, but I do like his suggestion about whether it's too late or not. It's not too late to start building communities that can support one another for the long haul. And if we're not too late, then great, we're going to have those communities to support one another in this better world that, or world that is livable at least. And if we are in the worst case scenarios that he predicts, then get to work and we can have these communities that will be what survives. But climate change is one of those things that the challenges are so great because it has to do with, the entire way of our economic and industrial system for 200 years, and the way we've looked at extraction of nature as having no value other than what can be extracted for private profit. So there's lots of challenges that I personally do not have control over, how we change our economic systems. I can make a good analysis and critique of what we should do, but I don't have the power to make those changes. But anything we do that moves towards moving away from fossil fuels, that encourages others. We just did a presentation in Fort Wayne with Purdue Climate Center that said the #1 thing that an individual can do on climate change is literally to talk with others about it. To literally just talk with others about it. And polls showed that a vast majority of Americans were open, like 85, 90% were open to talking about climate change with a friend or family member. But then they asked people what they thought others were open to hearing, and people were like, oh, only like 20% of people want to hear about it. No, most people are open to this conversation, but most people don't have these conversations. And so even if that is not itself sufficient, it's a good step for an individual. Like a thing an individual can do is talk about this with people on a regular basis so that it's not a taboo subject. And if people do that, then we can start to see the social demand, the social movement for the changes, the big changes that need to happen really quickly. Like at my church, last year we started saying, we've got 12 years to get this right. Well, now I guess we have 11 years to get this right. The time is not on our side on this. This is the one where that longevity and pacing ourselves really doesn't work in the same way because it can be too late. But one metaphor that I find helpful is, and it's not a perfect metaphor, but climate change, we think about the carbon emissions in our atmosphere, is a bit like salt in your soup. You've already put too much salt on your food, in your soup, and you can't take it out. It's already going to be too salty. It's not going to be great. But the least you can do is stop adding more salt. Like, stop making it worse. And so working to prevent and limit the damage that's already baked in, I think is important. There's a lot of, if you want to get cosmic, you can talk about, well, God, we don't have to save the planet. The planet's going to be just fine. I think the last time we had this much carbon in the atmosphere, there were forests in Antarctica. So, there's going to be trees and animals that are going to be loving Antarctica, 5,000 years from now. But we're really talking about humans and human and community survivability. And so the things that make climate change limit it are the very things that we need to be doing to prevent it, that make for a more just and equitable world. That's preaching on it, that's encouraging our congregations to connect our faith with loving the planet, and it's talking about it with others. And that's stuff that we can't do if we feel hopeless. Is it going to be enough? I don't know. There's no guarantee, but the minimum we can envision and keep that dream of a habitable world that not just for humans but for all creatures. And that's how we're gonna do it, I think. Does that help?
It does. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Cindy.
Yeah, that was wonderful. It actually connects with the question I had, which is, I feel like I've encountered, especially more recently, sort of progressive communities that were very fragmented when it comes to issues of justice. So what you just described with the climate crisis as being such a massive interconnected issue that engages politics and economics and education as well as science and consumerism and all these sorts of things, all wrapped up together, that if that sort of complex situations where we find ourselves in, yet when it comes to fighting for justice, we often go back into our very small fragmented corner, defending our own special justice issue to the neglect of another, worried that that to support somebody else's justice issue is somehow going to minimize the importance of mine, so that there ends up being a competition within progressive communities fighting for justice because, oh, eco-justice is just one more justice alongside other justice that's somehow separate from racial justice or genders or, economic or social,
Right.
So I'm curious if you've experienced that sort of division within activists in progressive communities, and what you recommend for overcoming that division.
All right, so I got a few thoughts here. So one, just on climate change, is that climate change is really a risk multiplier. So the communities that are vulnerable currently to natural disasters, to inequality, to health disparities, are the ones going to be most directly impacted first and the earliest and worst around climate change. And of course, eventually all of us will be, but it is a risk multiplier for any issue you care about. Climate change makes that issue worse. If you're concerned about refugee crises, it makes those situations worse. If you're about resource conflicts and violence in the Middle East, it makes those things worse. Now, practically speaking, I understand the logic of what you might call silos around activism, because any issue requires, if you're like a full-time professional, requires a lot of competence and knowledge, and there's a limit of how much any one person can know and be competent to explain something, especially if you're talking to elected officials and so forth. So I understand that reality, and there's people who focus on water tables, and aquifers, like that, that's like a whole thing, and in a certain region. So I understand that, and I don't begrudge that. We need people who can go deep, but we also need people who can go broad and make those connections. And I think often faith communities are a place where a lot of those connections can be made, because we're not experts, really. I mean, we might have our specialty on something. Andrew, you might know more about Jainism than most of us here, but we all have like our general, we can have a more general, broad understanding around certain justice issues, around certain moral imperatives, and some faith language framing. Now, as far as different, like the competition, I think I say this in the book, I've never successfully convinced somebody to be passionate about something they're not already passionate about, or they're not ready to be passionate about. I know how to, if someone's passionate about something and they don't know what to do, I can help that person. But if someone doesn't care about something, the most I can do is they go, that was a very interesting conversation. And that's the way it's been for 10 years. I've never successfully once seen a person who doesn't care or is not ready to care about something. You can give people certain opportunities. You can invite them to certain experiences that maybe they haven't reflected on, about different communities, but you can't make someone care about anything. So in some ways, I encourage people to, where they're passionate around some social justice issue, if it's all connected, then anywhere you fight it, you're helping. If it's a 10,000 headed monster, you're fighting one head, then you're helping in that process. And just recognize that that is one among many valid pieces, and that we have to recognize that we can support each other and stand alongside each other in sometimes more active, more passive ways. Like I said, for some things, I'll sign a petition or I'll go to an event, but I'm not going to organize the event, and I'm not going to create the program. But I can show up and I encourage others, because that's what I can do and how I can help. And if I did anything, because I also know if I try to do everything, I'll just get sick. And when I get sick, it takes like 2 weeks for me to get better, and it's just a waste of everyone's time. And one other thing I would say is it's really hard. I mean, I think our social justice passions are a bit like our great loves. Like your great love is your love. It's like how John Dominic Crossan talked about Jesus, when the Gospel of John, saying, for me, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Okay, let's have a conversation. And the same with justice issues. If you're dismissive of other people's concerns, I don't find that helpful. And even on things that I think are maybe empirically not more important, but they affect more people in more ways, like climate change, which I came to fairly late, and I came through class and race criticism. Like, I realized that my concerns were being affected by climate change. That's how I got there, honestly, in a lot of ways. But I don't find helpful to dismiss other people's concerns. Like the least helpful thing I've ever heard, I won't say who said it, was describing any justice, like working for a living wage, and those fights by unions is like rearranging the decks on the sinking Titanic. And I'm like, that doesn't help anybody. It just doesn't help. It's not useful. It's not a good metaphor. You can think that, but don't say it to somebody if you want to work with them. You just, that if someone told you the thing you're most passionate about is that, and it's part of a valid effort for a more just world, it's just not part of that. Yeah, I don't think that's useful. So not being dismissive of other people's concerns and recognizing that we're going to have different passions. And it's a trick as a pastor because, I've worked in places, not even have to be big place, where you have more issues people care about than people want to do it. You got like 3 issues per 2 people who are involved. And so it's like, okay, well, we're going to have to encourage where people are passionate and also see what can we do together that's in line with those values that we can come together on without dismissing those other pieces of energy. And I don't see another way around that. I've not seen a successful model besides that, and that seems to be one that can work. Does that help, Andrew?
I think so. I mean, so when you describe the wolf living with the lamb as an equivalent today, based on principles like our natural environment being a healthy one for communities across generations, work having dignity, and those most impacted by choices being involved in the decision making, and poverty being abolished. You talk about governments not being persecuting in their constituents, and an end to sort of state violence, people affirming differences between us as the source of strength and not as weaknesses. Mm-hmm. You have a list of things. It seems to me that
it's eschatological.
All of these are interconnected though, right? So if you really want to make progress on item 1, you can't do it to the exclusion of item 2, 3, and 4. It's sort of the way that the complexity and interconnection of the world requires an integral form of justice, and where we're recognizing that all of these special interests that each one of us might be passionate about separately really all are part of the same sort of web of justice. But I don't know how to articulate that in a way that isn't sort of dismissive of somebody saying, well, you're focused on only one issue and you need to expand your horizon and realize how that's part of the larger picture.
Well, maybe as a lure for feeling. I don't know, like start with the value that exists in what they're saying, because it is a value intrinsically on its own, but it also connects with everything else. And so you can use a more popular pedagogy of inviting people of where might these passions also connect with other issues, and hearing other stories, whether through case studies, but also helping them make those connections for themselves. Because if they don't feel it as relevant, they will prehend it negatively. Even if you want it, even if empirically they are connected, if they're not felt as connected, then it doesn't do any good to be right and for people to feel you negatively.
Right, and lose a potential partner.
Of course, and especially people who are working on things that are complementary to the work you're doing. And that can take time, and it's frustrating because some of these issues we don't feel like we have much time, especially on ones that decisions we make in the next decade really impact us for a long time. And so get frustrated, yell to yourself in another room, and then go, okay, how can we, work on this together?
Thanks. Other questions or thoughts?
You muted yourself, Andrew.
I was particularly interested in what you had to say about visionary gradualism. You say, and I'd love it if you could say a little bit more about that approach and why you favor it.
Sure. Well, because it's using kind of process. That's kind of how the book goes. It's like using process ideas and just applying them, not like explaining them. And so process talks about taking opposites and making them into a contrast. And so often you hear this kind of like, it's either like in the Democratic primary, there's the whole debate about incrementalism, step at a time, a little bit here, a little bit there, let's improve the Affordable Care Act, et cetera, or do we need a revolution and all the change that we need, and we need it right now, and we're going to push for it right now. Okay, well, I find what's helpful for me is the vision of what we need to be really radical, like where I list all the things that we want to see, over the end to state violence and the end to wealth disparities and extreme poverty and participatory democracy where everyone belongs. We need that, and we're going to critique whatever we have through that lens. But we also have to look at where are we now, and what is the next step to improve to make life better from where we are. And that's the gradualism piece. And we also, as soon as that's done and we achieve it, we celebrate, yay, and we, take a break for maybe an hour, maybe a day, maybe a week, and then we get back to work and start critiquing that from where we need to go next. And one of the examples I gave was around marriage equality in Argentina, where they had a much more intersectional coalition doing that work. And they made it happen with a lot of resistance, especially from the Roman Catholic Church. And they celebrated when they achieved it, which included state payment for gender reassignment surgeries. So even more progressive than I think a lot of what we have. And then they started talking about indigenous rights, because indigenous communities were part of that coalition for marriage equality. And so they started pushing there, as opposed to saying, all right, we did it, life's over, or life's done, we've reached the eschaton. And so being impatient and having that vision of what we need and not compromising on that at all, but also recognizing that what is the next thing that needs to happen from where we are right now. The world we have, as Suhaki says it, Marjorie Suhaki, process feminist theologian, God takes the world as it is and invites it to what it can be. And so that's that gradualism part, but also there's a larger vision of value where all things are affirmed for themselves, each other, and the whole. And until we get there, we're not going to be satisfied, and we're not going to rest. That's that vision that we keep seeking on. And even if we achieve every single thing that we in 2019 feel was needed for a just world, there'd be new issues. There'd be some other thing that we need to think about that we can't even envision right now, because all of our attention is focused on certain things that we see as important, and there's no energy or oxygen left to think about that. And so that's also a little bit about that visionary gradualism. It's influenced a bit from Michael Harrington, who was one of the founders of the Democratic Socialists of America. But I'm using it slightly, the terms from him, but I'm using it slightly differently. For more generally speaking, not just on class and economic justice, but on a larger vision for change.
Thanks.
Of course.
Other questions? I see some great people waiting in the wings, and I know that they have amazing things to say, and maybe they're having technical issues and figuring out how to unmute themselves.
It's on the bottom left part of your screen. There's a little button that says mute, and it probably has an X or like a little red slash by a microphone, and you click it and it unmutes you. Andrew, can I say a bit about where people can purchase the book if they are interested while where people are thinking?
Yeah.
So it's available on Chalice Press, and I think it's like chalicepress.com/sustaining hope, or just Google Sustaining Hope in an Unjust World, and it's one of the first links to show up. It's also available on Amazon. I mean, Amazon, I'm not, Amazon's Amazon, and I'm not gonna, but I would suggest, use Chalice Press before Amazon, if you can, but I won't tell you not to use Amazon. I don't know if Process and Faith, are you all still selling books? I don't know if you have it in
We may be using Amazon to help sell
Okay.
books.
All right. Okay. All right. I understand. We live in the world that we live in, and you can critique it, and you also need to like
Well, I
sell
figured
sell
you
books
know,
on critiquing Amazon.
as you say,
On Amazon.
you don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? So
Yeah, I don't like that phrase because it often sounds like, you know, it like, oh, your concerns are not important, but yeah, it's that, and then you also critique that compromise as unjust.
yeah,
Do both.
yeah. But I think the idea that a better world does not entail a perfect world, and that fighting for justice doesn't mean that we get to that sort of perfect state of a just world and then it's all done. As you just described, you know, you accomplish a sort of a win somewhere, but then we can't even anticipate the injustices that are going to happen in the future.
Exactly, and it reminds me also of the fact that if we could have a once and for all perfect future world, then you could sacrifice anything and anyone to get there, because once you get there, it's worth it. But if we're going to have an ambiguous result and an ambiguous world with wins and losses, then the way we need to get there matters as much as that result we're going for. And so even the process we're doing needs to be one that builds community and that builds those relationships, because that is the world, is that process of those building relationships and connecting, and not just saying we're all interconnected, but helping people experience that for themselves. Which can be something that faith communities at their best can be helpful with.
Linda. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Pia, Linda Pia. I'm in the Bay Area. I'm kind of a lurker today. I just got intrigued by the title of the book, and I had a little bit of extra time, so I thought I would, my first foray into this book club. I just wanted to, just before you finish, I just wanted to say how much I enjoy, Timothy, your reading of the excerpt. It was very profound, but it was very easy. It was very entertaining at the same time. Entertaining is probably not the right word, but certainly I was sort of compelled to really listen very deeply to it. And I think sometimes your examples were just so powerful and easy to assimilate, and I think it was powerful in that sense. So I just wanted to thank you for how well you've written it and how beautifully it sort of flowed from you. Yeah, thank you. And I guess one of the reasons I was interested in your book was I'm just interested in how people are thinking about these problems in terms of process. And anyway, I just want to appreciate that. I appreciate that you addressed it. I thought very, very, very well. So thank you so much.
Linda Pia, thank you so much for your affirmations. And I'm glad that you found the prologue, what the excerpt I read, engaging both as a listener and as ideas. And that's really kind of how I wanted the book to be. I mean, every paragraph may not be, have that same balance, but I try to hold both there, because this isn't, I don't mean this to be an academic book. I mean it to be a book that actually helps people and helps them kind of work through this. And I don't pretend to have all the answers. It's really designed as a book for a group to discuss. That's why I put in discussion questions at the end of each chapter, or for further reading if people want to go deeper in these types of questions. One thing I find frustrating in kind of general audience books is authors that pretend that every idea they write it's like no one else has ever thought it before. And so I try to connect it with a history of thought without like having to cite. So I tried not to cite because I didn't want it to be that kind of footnotey academic book, but still connecting with those things, and then also having lots of examples. And so at times it will sound like, it reads like a sermon, but it's just a really long 5-hour sermon, I guess, with lots of breaks and times for reflection and breakout discussions, I suppose. But
Yeah.
thank you again.
No, well done. Thank you so much.
So we have another question from Garth, who's actually joining us from New Zealand. And he says, Tim, in this great experiment some people call life, I have long personally discovered there is no interventionist God, but I find this hard to explain intellectually. Could you please say some more about God and power?
Sure, Garth, and thank you for being on this this video chat. I'm not sure what hour it is. It is, for me, it is almost 8 o'clock, and it might be, maybe it's 8 a.m. for you. Maybe it's I'm not sure. It might be 8 o'clock for you too, but a different one. But as far as talking about God and power, I think there's a lot of process thinkers who've talked about this a lot, and so kind of and Andrew, if you want to help me out here or add anything that I might miss, that God is involved in every action and decision of the universe, but God controls none of it in a final way. So if we think about God's engagement with the world, we can talk about God's invitation, technically called the initial aim, to every entity, to every creature. And so God invites us to options that can affirm value and lead to more complex and beautiful life, or it can be decisions that say no to that. And so God's power is the power of involvement with everything, but control in nothing. But when we say no, that isn't the end either, because God will go, all right, well, you've made a mess of this, so now I got to figure out what are some more options for how something can be beautiful or more healed from the mistakes and the decisions that have been made. So I think that God invites us to affirm the value of everything or entity, if you want to be technical about it, as valuable for itself, valuable for others, and valuable for the whole world. And when we do that, we create a more dynamic and diverse and intense universe. And when we select something less beautiful than that, then we damage others or exclude others or oppress others. And so God's power is an infinite power to never fail at inviting us to another possibility, but also the weakest power because it does not control any of it, but has decision for the smallest entity that can make a decision possible. So God's power is perfect in its relationship and also perfect in its responsiveness to us and in the freedom that is innate in existence of entities. So, Andrew, did I miss anything there? Or I don't like to get into the technical weeds as best I can because it can get very dry and boring very quickly. But
no, I think that was great. I mean, just generally, process people talk about God's power in terms of cooperation rather than coercion, and talk about God's power as relational rather than unilateral. And that's exactly what Timothy just described.
I was very boldly, I preached on this notion not too long ago, and I made a little joke and used like some really technical process language of like, and technically what this means is da 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 da, but nobody cares, and let's just move. So it's there, and it's like the intellectual assumptions, but I think most of us are looking more for the meaning part, and is it compelling in a way? Garth, does that help? It might be there's more.
I think adding to Garth's question, that if you could say a little about how a relationally powerful God operates in an unjust world in calling us to fight for justice, even when we sometimes lose.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that process and liberationist concerns are completely compatible. Process thought has often, theology has been strong where people have their interests. And so it's generally been strong in interfaith relations, in environmental thought, and religion and science, and feminist thought. That's kind of historically where it's strong. And it's not generally as historically strong in race and class analysis. Why? Because there have been a lot of people who've done that work. And so I wanted to look at those things together. And for me, liberation's preferential option for the oppressed is God's desire for the maximization of intensity and harmony. If you're going to get into the technical aspects of how value is produced in a process world. But so God wishes for that maximization of value for oneself, value for others, and value for the whole. And any system any injustice is almost always is denying the value of something, either for itself, for others, or for the whole. Every social injustice, inequity I've seen or that I can think of has involved some version of denying value of something in that way, as opposed to recognizing the value for itself, others, in the world. And so God sees that and invites us to see that and to act upon it. And so when we don't, God responds saying, all right, well, from this situation, here's some options of how you can recognize that value for yourself, for others, and the world. And when we do, justice happens and injustice and inequity is reduced. And when we don't, we make another mess of the world, and we add salt in the soup, and God goes, all right, well, let's see what we can do with this. And so God never fails. Every time there's a crucifixion, there can be a resurrection. And then there can be another crucifixion. And then another resurrection. And then someone might say, you know what, I'm just going to go get a sandwich. And they just like walk away. But that someone else is inspired and respond in different ways. And so that's kind of how I think about God's relationship with power and that relational kind of quality there.
And what I like about, I was just saying, what I like about that is that in a classical view of theism, or like an omnipotent God of unilateral power, where everything that happens in the world is God's will, that basically just means that all injustices that we see, that we feel so uncomfortable with, that just seem absolutely wrong, is somehow part of God's plan. And that really paints God in an undesirable light. And the process view of God is relationally powerful, constantly calling us to do better, to work with God, to bring about a more just and better world. To me, I find much more compelling.
Yeah, that was the insight I had when I was 19, when I had cancer, was this notion that God did not give me the cancer, but to the extent that I had cancer, God could use that experience for something good. Now, that does not mean it happened so that something good could happen, that it is not one leads to the other. But because this awful thing happened, God's like, all right, well, you can be a more compassionate person because of experience, or you can be more of a jerk. What are you going to do? And so I took that as an opportunity to expand my horizons of concern for others, to say, well, no one should have to face this, and no one should not have health insurance. There was nothing about me that deserved to get this care. It had to do with my dad having health insurance and me having it through him. And so you can, those experiences, God, it's invited me to say, all right, well, what are we going to do with this awful situation of having cancer, and respond. And so that's how God's power works. That's deeply personal for me, and that's kind of foundational to my self-understanding in a lot of ways. But I also think it applies to social justice concerns, and not just the individual tribulations that happen in our lives. I mean, I don't want to dismiss the individual stuff, but we're not just individuals. We're persons in community that have our personal centers of experience in relation to others. Andrew, I just want to be mindful of time. We've gone a little over an hour. Maybe if we want to a final question or whatnot. I'm not sure where people are at. If they want to keep talking, I'm happy to do so. I just don't want to bore people if they're ready to go.
Yeah. Any new questions from the audience? I'd love to. What you describe, so much of what you describe is a sort of possible future that we might be able to move toward, the lion laying with the lamb kind of thing. Sounded to me like ecological civilization in the way that John Cobb and some of my friends are working on. And I'm wondering how you felt about that. Is that sort of, are you okay with that connection? And what exactly would it look like for us to live into that kind of a vision of a better, although not perfect, future?
Well, I'm happy to be associated with ecological civilization, and I would think that in the long term,
we'll take you.
Okay, great. In the long term, we certainly have to not take more than we put into our planet to make that work for more than several generations, and we're reaching the limits in the end of the system we're in, and some would say we're well past those limits and we're just waiting for the other shoe to drop. So I don't know how that's all going to look, but if we can begin to at least think about how will our actions sustain life for at least 7 generations, and it's hard for me, honestly, to think 7 generations ahead, but it's not that hard if you think about it. If you're the 4th generation, if you think of your great-grandparents and your great-grandchildren, that's 7 generations right there. And you can envision that. You can envision your great-grandparents and your great-grandchildren and a world that sustains them through that process. I think that's doable. It doesn't have to be us at the beginning of it. Maybe that's an American thing. But I only noticed that like last year. It's like, oh wait, I could be the 4th generation in there. I can see that now. But certainly we need to be able to live in a way that humans survive for like 100,000 years or however long it's been, but we seem to be making an effort to wrap things up in the next 100. So, but I believe that it doesn't have to be that way. And I don't know what that's going to look like, but I know that all the answers are the answers of more moving towards a more ecological way of relating to one another, not just around the environment, but like just our way of thinking relationally with others, and seeing those connections. And so I'm glad to be part of that work in the modest ways I can. And if this book helps with that, I'm glad with that too.
I find it helpful, and I love the language. You made me think that hope amidst defeat is sort of like faith amidst doubt. They're not incompatible, but they're actually inseparable.
I think you just associated me with Paul Tillich, so I'll take that.
Sounds good. All right. Well, if there are no other questions burning from the audience, I guess we can wrap up. Thank you so much, Timothy, for joining us, and look forward to your next book.
I think actually the next book would likely be a children's a picture book. My idea is based off a sermon I gave around bioluminescent diversity, divinity, and the idea is Jesus going around Galilee and learning from fireflies and jellyfish how to glow with the transfiguration. So he sees them, and then at the end, they're all like around him, and they see him glow, and they're like, "You did it, Jesus!" And so, but that will take a little while. I'm not going to be writing anything anytime soon, but we'll see.
Well, that sounds really cool. Thanks for sharing tonight.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a good night or morning, depending on where you are.
Andrew, thank you for organizing this and making this happen.
All right. We'll stay in touch.
Great. Take care.